August 19th, 1947, Nuremberg, Germany. Courtroom 600 at the Palace of Justice. 23 defendants sit in the dock. 20 of them are physicians, licensed medical doctors with university degrees, published research, years of clinical practice, men who took an oath to do no harm. One of them, Karl Brandt, was Adolf Hitler's personal physician. Another, Karl Gebhardt, served as president of the German Red Cross. A third, Waldemar Hoven, ran the medical clinic at Buchenwald concentration camp. Today, the tribunal is preparing to hand down sentences. 7 of these doctors will be executed. 5 will receive life imprisonment. The rest will face decades behind bars. Their crime wasn't combat. It wasn't espionage. It wasn't even the experiments that filled most of the trial testimony. The crime that sealed their fate, the one that made judges certain these men deserved death, was something else entirely. A program that began in 1939, 6 years before the war ended. A program that operated inside hospitals, nursing homes, and psychiatric institutions across Germany. A program that killed at least 70,000 people, most of them German citizens, many of them children. And here's what makes this uniquely horrifying. Every single death was documented. Every victim had a medical file. Every killing was signed off by a licensed physician who filled out a death certificate, stamped it with official seals, and mailed it to grieving families with fabricated causes of death. This wasn't the chaos of war. This wasn't soldiers losing control in combat. This was medicine transformed into an execution system. Doctors selecting patients for death based on checklists. Nurses administering lethal overdoses in pediatric wards. Administrators coordinating transports from institutions to killing centers disguised as clinics. All of it organized, bureaucratic, methodical, and all of it preserved in paper trails that prosecutors would later use to dismantle every defense these doctors tried to offer. The program had a code name, Action T4, named after the address of its headquarters, Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin. And when Allied investigators discovered the files in 1945, hidden in remote castles and abandoned mines where Nazi officials desperately tried to bury the evidence, they found something that changed how the world understood medical ethics forever. They found doctors who believed killing was treatment, who convinced themselves that ending certain lives was merciful, scientific, even patriotic, who built an entire system to identify, transport, and exterminate human beings, and called it healthcare. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly how that system worked, how doctors chose victims, how hospitals became killing centers, how death certificates were forged and families were deceived, and most importantly, how 5 years later, in a Nuremberg courtroom, prosecutors presented evidence so overwhelming, so methodically documented by the perpetrators themselves, that 7 doctors walked to the gallows knowing their own signatures had condemned them. Because this isn't just history. This is the reason every modern medical ethics code exists, every informed consent form you sign, every institutional review board, every patient's bill of rights. They all trace back to what happened when the world discovered doctors in white coats had murdered 70,000 people and kept perfect records while doing it. So the question we're answering today isn't whether these doctors committed murder. The evidence made that undeniable. The question is, how did licensed physicians, educated men who understood anatomy and pharmacology and the Hippocratic Oath, convince themselves that killing patients was medicine? And why did the judges who heard their defenses decide that execution, not imprisonment, was the only possible sentence? Stay with me. By the end, you'll understand why the words medical license became evidence of premeditated murder. But first, we need to rewind to May 1945, to the moment Allied forces discovered filing cabinets full of death certificates hidden in places the Nazis thought no one would ever find. Before we go further, if this kind of detailed historical analysis using trial transcripts and primary source documents is what you're looking for, I'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps me continue producing deep dives like this. And as we walk through this story, I want you to think about a question and drop your answer in the comments. If a doctor truly believes that ending a patient's life will prevent suffering, does that belief change the moral calculation? Or is killing without consent always murder, regardless of the justification? I read every comment, and I'm genuinely curious where you draw that line. All right, let's get into it. May 8th, 1945, Germany surrenders. Within days, Allied forces are moving through the country, securing government buildings, seizing documents, arresting officials. The headquarters at Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin has been destroyed by Allied bombing. The Nazis knew it was coming. In the final weeks of the war, as defeat became inevitable, T4 program administrators frantically moved their most incriminating documents out of the capital. They packed files into boxes and transported them to remote locations, hidden bunkers, abandoned mines, medieval castles in the Austrian countryside, places they thought Allied investigators would never search. They were wrong. In June 1945, American forces arrive at Hartheim Castle in Austria, a Renaissance fortress that locals whispered about throughout the war. The building had been a T4 killing center. More than 30 Auzuran people were murdered there, first under the official euthanasia program, then as part of operations targeting concentration camp prisoners too weak to work. When investigators enter the castle, they find evidence of hasty evacuation, crematorium equipment partially dismantled, gas chamber apparatus removed but visible residue remaining. And in an administrative office, they find a steel safe. The door is locked. American investigator Charles Dameron forces it open. Inside, he discovers a 39-page document. It's titled Hartheim Statistics, monthly tallies of patients killed, breakdowns by institution, cost-benefit analyses calculating money saved by eliminating people who consumed state resources, charts projecting future economic gains if the killing continued. The document uses bureaucratic euphemisms throughout. Victims are called disinfections, but the numbers are precise, the dates are exact, and the signatures are clear. This isn't a hastily scribbled confession. This is an official program report produced for internal Nazi healthcare administration, documenting systematic murder with the clinical detachment of a quarterly earnings statement. Other documents are discovered at different sites, registration forms in basement archives, transport manifests hidden in mine shafts, correspondence between doctors buried in castle cellars. By summer 1945, investigators have assembled a staggering collection of evidence. And what makes this evidence uniquely damning is that the perpetrators created it themselves. They documented their crimes because they believed what they were doing was legitimate state policy. They thought they were following orders. They never imagined those orders would become exhibits in a war crimes trial. Let me explain what these documents revealed and why their discovery would become the foundation for prosecuting doctors at Nuremberg. In September 1939, Adolf Hitler signed a secret authorization. It wasn't a formal law. It wasn't debated in any government body. It was a single-page letter, backdated to September 1st, the day Germany invaded Poland, giving two men, Philipp Buller and Karl Brandt, authority to expand the powers of specific physicians. Those physicians were authorized to grant a mercy death to patients considered incurably ill after critical evaluation. That phrase, mercy death, was the euphemism that would disguise mass murder. The program officially targeted people with severe mental illness, physical disabilities, chronic conditions that required long-term institutional care. The rationale, as presented internally, was economic and ideological. These patients consumed resources. They required beds, food, medical staff, and funding. In a nation preparing for total war, they were classified as useless eaters. Burdens on the state, lives unworthy of life. But here's the critical detail that made this program different from other Nazi atrocities. And here's what made it legally prosecutable, even under the chaotic standards of wartime. The program required medical participation at every level. It wasn't soldiers carrying out orders. It wasn't SS units conducting executions. It was doctors making selections, doctors authorizing transports, doctors administering lethal drugs, doctors signing death certificates, licensed physicians using medical authority to kill, and that medical authority left a paper trail that couldn't be destroyed, couldn't be denied, and couldn't be explained away as battlefield necessity. But before the T4 program targeted adults in gas chambers, it began with something even more chilling: children. In hospital wards, killed slowly by pediatricians who convinced themselves they were preventing suffering. The children's euthanasia program actually started slightly before the adult T4 program in August 1939. It operated differently, more quietly, more intimately. There were no gas chambers for children, no mass transports to centralized killing facilities. Instead, the murders happened in pediatric clinics across Germany, in children's hospitals that parents trusted, in wards where nurses worked and doctors made rounds. The methods were clinical, deliberate, designed to appear medical rather than murderous. Doctors identified children with disabilities, developmental delays, physical deformities, chronic illnesses. They didn't use registration forms reviewed by distant committees. They made selections during examinations, during hospital visits, during routine care. Once a child was marked, the process began. Some children received overdoses of sedatives, luminol or veronal, added to food or administered by injection. Others were given morphine scopolamine injections, a combination that suppressed breathing and caused death that could be attributed to respiratory failure. Still, others were subjected to deliberate starvation, placed on special diets that provided insufficient calories, fed portions so small they slowly wasted away over weeks or months. Nurses recorded their declining weight. Doctors noted their deteriorating condition. And when death finally came, the certificate listed malnutrition or failure to thrive. Natural causes. One documented case describes a boy who refused the medication doctors tried to give him. He spat out the luminol tablets. He refused food laced with sedatives. So medical staff held him down, two men restraining a terrified child, while a nurse injected morphine scopolamine directly. The next day, he was dead. The death certificate claimed pneumonia. His parents received condolences from the hospital director, praising the medical team's efforts to save their son. This happened in pediatric wards throughout Germany. Doctors and nurses, people trained to care for vulnerable children, administering lethal drugs and calling it treatment. And here's what makes this historically critical. The children's program taught German doctors that medical killing was possible, that it could be organized, documented, and concealed within normal hospital operations, that death certificates could hide murder, that families would believe medical authorities. When the T4 program expanded to adults later in 1939, it scaled up the methodology but kept the core principle. Doctors select, doctors authorize, doctors kill, doctors certify. The adult program just industrialized the process. Here's how the adult system worked. The Reich Ministry of the Interior ordered all psychiatric hospitals, nursing homes, and institutions for disabled individuals to report their patient populations. The order was framed as a wartime census, necessary for resource allocation. Institution directors complied and filled out registration forms for every patient under their care, detailing diagnoses, work capacity, length of institutionalization, and family background. Those forms were sent to Berlin, where a panel of medical experts reviewed them. 3 doctors reviewed each form independently. They didn't examine the patients. They didn't visit the institutions. They made life and death decisions based solely on paperwork. A plus sign meant the patient should be killed. A minus sign meant they could live, for now. The selection criteria were chilling in their specificity. Patients who couldn't work were prioritized. Patients institutionalized for more than 5 years were prioritized. Patients classified as criminally insane were automatically marked. And patients who weren't ethnically German, particularly Jewish patients, or those from occupied territories, were almost universally selected, regardless of their actual medical condition. This wasn't mercy. This was eugenics, dressed up as healthcare. Once a patient was selected, the machinery moved quickly. Gray buses with painted-over windows arrived at institutions, usually early in the morning. Patients were loaded, sometimes sedated to keep them calm. The buses bore Red Cross markings, medical vehicle designations. They looked legitimate. They traveled to one of 6 killing centers established specifically for the T4 program: Grafeneck, Brandenburg, Bernburg, Hartheim, Sonnenstein, Hadamar. These weren't concentration camps. They were medical facilities, former hospitals or sanitariums converted for the program's purposes. Each had a staff of doctors, nurses, administrators. Each had a gas chamber disguised as a shower room. Each had a crematorium to dispose of bodies. And each kept meticulous records. Here's what happened when patients arrived. They were brought to a reception area where a doctor conducted a brief examination. This wasn't a real medical assessment. It was theater, creating documentation to justify what came next. The doctor would select a false cause of death from a prepared list: pneumonia, heart failure, sepsis, stroke, common conditions that wouldn't raise suspicion. After the examination, patients were told they were going to shower. Now, they were led to a room designed to look like a communal bath. Shower heads were mounted on the ceiling. Benches lined the walls. But the pipes weren't connected to water. They were connected to carbon monoxide canisters. Once the room was full, usually 15 to 20 patients at a time, the door was sealed. A doctor or trained technician opened the gas valves from an adjacent room. Death came within 10 to 15 minutes. Medical staff monitored through a small window, timing the process. When movement ceased, ventilation fans cleared the gas. Bodies were removed and transferred to the crematorium. Before cremation, gold dental work was extracted, jewelry was removed, then the bodies were burned. The ashes were placed in urns, and families received notification that their relative had died suddenly of natural causes. The urn would arrive by mail within days, along with condolence letters on official stationery, signed by the facility's medical director. Some families received the wrong ashes. Some received urns that still contained body parts that hadn't fully cremated. These errors would later become evidence of the program's systematic deception. Now, here's what makes this program particularly relevant to the Nuremberg trial. And here's what connects it directly to the Holocaust that followed. The T4 program became the prototype, the testing ground, for the industrialized murder that would define the Holocaust. Here's what you need to understand. When the Nazi leadership decided to implement the final solution, to systematically exterminate Europe's Jewish population, they didn't start from scratch. They used the expertise, the personnel, and the technology perfected in the T4 program. The connection is direct and undeniable. In 1942, the SS launched Operation Reinhard, the plan to murder Jews in occupied Poland through purpose-built extermination camps: Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka. These weren't concentration camps. They were killing factories designed for one purpose: mass murder through poison gas. And who designed them? Who commanded them? Who operated them? Men from the T4 program. Every single commandant of an Operation Reinhard killing center came directly from T4. Christian Wirth, who ran the Hartheim Killing Center and perfected the gas chamber process, became Inspector General of Operation Reinhard. He personally supervised construction of the extermination camps, applying everything he learned killing disabled patients. Franz Stangl, who managed the Hartheim facility, became Commandant of Treblinka. Irmfried Eberl, a T4 doctor, commanded Treblinka before Stangl. These weren't random appointments. These were deliberate selections based on proven expertise in mass killing. The technology transferred directly. The T4 program used carbon monoxide gas piped into chambers designed to look like showers. Operation Reinhard used the same system, scaled up. Larger chambers, more victims per session. But the fundamental design, the deception, the process, all came from T4. Even the method of generating the carbon monoxide was adapted from T4 experience. Large diesel engines running continuously, exhaust funneled through pipes into sealed rooms. The technical staff who installed gas chambers at Belzec and Sobibor had previously installed them at Hadamar and Bernburg. This historical connection is critical because it shows how the T4 program didn't just kill 70,000 people. It created the infrastructure, human and technical, for killing millions. It trained the personnel. It refined the procedures. It demonstrated that industrial-scale murder was organizationally possible, that victims could be deceived until the final moments, that bodies could be efficiently disposed of, that paperwork could create plausible deniability. When prosecutors at Nuremberg presented evidence about T4, they weren't just prosecuting one program. They were exposing the roots of the Holocaust itself. But by late 1940, problems were emerging with the T4 program. Families were asking questions. Catholic Bishop Clemens August Graf von Galen delivered a sermon in August 1941 condemning the program, calling it murder, demanding it stop. The sermon was distributed throughout Germany, read from pulpits, copied and circulated despite Gestapo attempts to suppress it. Public awareness grew, pressure mounted. In August 1941, Hitler verbally ordered the official T4 program suspended, not because he opposed it morally, but because continued operation risked civil unrest. But here's the critical detail. The suspension was bureaucratic fiction. The program didn't stop. It decentralized. Killing continued at individual institutions through what became known as wild euthanasia. Doctors at hospitals and nursing homes continued selecting patients, but instead of transports to gas chambers, they returned to the methods used in the children's program. Starvation diets, lethal drug overdoses, phenol injections, morphine scopolamine combinations. Deaths were slower, more distributed, harder to track. But the total death toll continued climbing. By the war's end, estimates suggest at least 200,000 Allern people were killed through the combined official and decentralized euthanasia programs, though only about 273 deaths are directly documented from the centralized T4 phase, and every one of those deaths had a doctor's signature authorizing it. Now let's talk about what happened when Allied investigators found all those signatures hidden in castles and mines, when prosecutors began preparing cases for Nuremberg, when they realized they had something unprecedented, a genocide committed entirely by medical professionals with complete documentation. April through June 1945. As Allied forces advanced through Germany and Austria, intelligence units are specifically tasked with locating medical records. At Hadamar, American investigators discover the facility still operating. Staff are still on site. The gas chamber is intact. And in administrative offices, filing cabinets hold thousands of patient files, transport manifests, death certificates. At Hartheim Castle, investigators find the steel safe containing the statistical reports. The 39-page document with monthly death tallies, economic calculations, projected savings. At other sites, they discover correspondence between doctors, personnel files showing doctors applied for T4 positions, payment records proving financial compensation for selections. By summer 1945, the scope is undeniable. This wasn't isolated misconduct by a few rogue physicians. This was systematic involvement by hundreds of doctors across Germany's medical establishment. The question facing prosecutors was how to present this in court. So American prosecutors made a decision. They would convene a separate tribunal, a trial focused specifically on medical crimes, and they would use the T4 program as the foundation for establishing that doctors could be held criminally responsible for state-sanctioned killing. December 9th, 1946. The doctors' trial begins. United States of America versus Karl Brandt et al. 23 defendants, 20 of them physicians. The trial will last 140 days. Chief Prosecutor Brigadier General Telford Taylor stands before the tribunal and describes the T4 program in detail. He explains how the program began, how doctors were recruited, how killing centers were established, how families were deceived, and then he makes a critical argument. He tells the judges that the experiments conducted in concentration camps grew directly from the T4 program. That once German doctors accepted killing disabled patients as legitimate medicine, extending that logic to prisoners, to Jews, to anyone classified as undesirable became inevitable. That the personnel and technology from T4 were directly transferred to the Holocaust's extermination camps. The T4 program wasn't just one crime among many. It was the gateway. The prosecution's evidence presentation is methodical. They enter registration forms, transport orders, death certificates into evidence. Then they present the Hartheim statistics, reports documenting 273 deaths during the official program phase from September 1939 to August 1941. They call witnesses, survivors who escaped transports, family members who questioned death certificates, former T4 employees who witnessed the killing process. One nurse describes working at Grafeneck, the buses arriving, the brief examinations, the gas chamber operations, doctors selecting false causes of death from prepared lists, the crematorium running constantly, the ashes being packaged for families. The defense attorneys face an impossible challenge. The evidence is overwhelming. So they adopt several defense strategies. State authorization. They argue physicians were following lawful commands from legitimate state authority. The prosecution responds that no state authority can override a physician's obligation to do no harm, that many doctors volunteered for T4 positions, that this was employment, not compulsion, mercy and medical judgment. They claim they were preventing suffering. The prosecution shows selection criteria had nothing to do with suffering, that many victims were capable of meaningful life, that families weren't consulted, that children tried to refuse lethal drugs and were held down by force. Following medical consensus, they argue eugenics was accepted internationally. The prosecution shows other eugenic programs didn't involve killing, that no legitimate medical consensus supported killing patients without consent. Every defense crumbles when confronted with documentation the doctors themselves created. The judges hear this evidence day after day, week after week. They examine documents. They visit exhibits showing gas chamber equipment, crematorium diagrams. And slowly, the tribunal's verdict takes shape. By summer 1947, closing arguments conclude. The judges adjourn to deliberate. They're establishing legal precedent for how international law addresses medical crimes. They're defining what physicians can never do, regardless of state authorization, wartime conditions, or claimed medical justification. August 20th, 1947. The judges reconvene. The courtroom is packed. The defendants sit in 2 rows, their faces tense. Judge Walter Beals presiding begins reading the judgment. When it reaches the section on the T4 euthanasia program, the language becomes sharp, unambiguous. The tribunal states that the T4 program represents murder on a massive scale, conducted by physicians who violated the most fundamental principles of medical ethics. The judgment emphasizes several key findings. First, the program lacked any legitimate medical purpose that could justify the deaths. Second, there was no consent. Death certificates were falsified to conceal the killings. Third, participation was voluntary for physicians. Fourth, the program violated established medical ethics that transcend national law. And fifth, the program created the foundation for subsequent medical crimes. The judges note that T4 personnel and technology were transferred directly to the Operation Reinhard extermination camps, that the gas chambers at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka were designed by men who perfected the technique at Hadamar and Hartheim, that the T4 program wasn't just one atrocity among many, but the prototype that made industrial genocide possible. The judgment then addresses the defendants individually. Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician and Reich Commissioner for Health, is found guilty on all counts. He was a principal architect of the T4 program, coordinating between Nazi leadership and medical authorities, expanding the program from adults to include children. Sentence: death by hanging. Victor Brack, head of the Chancellery office that administered T4, guilty on all counts. He managed daily operations, coordinated transports, extended the program into concentration camps. Sentence: death by hanging. Waldemar Hoven, chief medical officer at Buchenwald, guilty. He implemented T4 principles at Buchenwald, selecting prisoners for death, administering poisons, falsifying death certificates. Sentence: death by hanging. Karl Gebhardt, president of the German Red Cross, guilty. He applied T4 logic in camp settings, treating prisoners as expendable experimental subjects. Sentence: death by hanging. 4 other defendants receive death sentences. Several receive life imprisonment. Others get sentences ranging from 10 to 25 years. 7 are acquitted. The tribunal notes that these defendants didn't just kill. They systematically deceived. They used medical credentials to gain access to victims. They exploited families' trust in doctors. They falsified death certificates to conceal crimes. They corrupted every aspect of medical practice. The judges conclude that some crimes are so fundamental, so destructive of basic human values, that execution is the only sentence that conveys their gravity, that the law must send an unmistakable message. Medicine has absolute limits. and crossing them carries ultimate consequences. June the 2nd, 1948. Landsberg Prison, Bavaria. The executions are carried out. 7 men who once wore white coats, who held medical degrees from respected universities, who took oaths to preserve life, climb 13 steps to the gallows. Karl Brandt's last words reportedly express no remorse. He claims history will vindicate him. History has not been kind. The executions mark a turning point in humanity's understanding of medical ethics. The trial established principles that now govern all medical practice worldwide. And the most important principle emerged directly from the judge's analysis of the T4 program. Voluntary informed consent is absolutely mandatory for any medical intervention. After the doctor's trial concluded, the tribunal issued a 10-point code of medical research ethics. Today we call it the Nuremberg Code. The first principle states, the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. That sounds obvious now. In 1947, it wasn't codified anywhere in international law. Subjects must have capacity to consent. They must be free from coercion. They must understand risks and benefits. They must be able to withdraw at any time. Experiments must be designed to minimize suffering. Subjects must be protected from injury and death. Researchers must terminate experiments if continuation threatens subjects' safety. Every one of these principles emerged from analyzing what German doctors did wrong. The Nuremberg Code became the foundation for all subsequent medical ethics frameworks. The Declaration of Helsinki, adopted in 1964, expanded these principles for clinical research. The Belmont Report in 1979 created the ethical framework for institutional review boards that oversee research today. Modern informed consent documents all trace back to the recognition forced by the T4 evidence. Patients must know what's being done to them and must have the power to refuse. The T4 program fundamentally changed how societies think about medical killing and end-of-life care. Before Nuremberg, these issues weren't clearly addressed in law or ethics. After Nuremberg, the world drew hard lines. The T4 program began with a premise that sounds superficially reasonable. Some patients suffer endlessly with no hope of recovery. Ending their lives might be merciful. But here's the critical difference the doctor's trial established: the presence or absence of patient consent. Modern end-of-life frameworks, in jurisdictions where physician-assisted death is legal, require rigorous consent protocols. Patients must request it multiple times. They must be mentally competent. They must be terminally ill. Physicians must confirm the diagnosis independently. These safeguards exist specifically because of T4. The T4 program killed people who hadn't requested death, who couldn't consent, who were selected by doctors applying economic and eugenic criteria. That's not medical aid in dying. That's murder. The tribunal ruled that no one, not doctors, not families, not the state, has authority to end a patient's life without that patient's knowing voluntary consent. And if the patient lacks capacity to consent, then medical killing is forbidden entirely. Period. No exceptions. Modern medical privacy laws and patient rights protections exist partly because of the program's documentation abuses. The T4 program created detailed files on victims, using intimate medical information to justify killings. Today, laws like HIPAA and GDPR give patients control over their medical information. The T4 program also changed how medical professionals think about following orders. The doctor's trial ruled that medical ethics transcend governmental authority, that doctors have personal responsibility for their actions regardless of who ordered them, that I was following orders is never a defense for medical killing. Quick reminder, if you're finding this analysis valuable and you haven't already, please take a second to like this video. It helps with the algorithm and lets me know this type of deep dive content is what you want to see. And drop a comment. Do you think medical professionals today adequately understand this history? Should Nazi medical crimes be required in medical education worldwide? The T4 program specifically targeted people with disabilities, classifying them as burdens, as lives unworthy of life. Today, disability rights organizations cite the T4 program when challenging policies or rhetoric that devalues disabled lives. The connection isn't abstract. Some of the same arguments T4 doctors made, that resources are limited, that certain patients consume disproportionate care, appear in modern healthcare debates. The safeguard is maintaining absolute commitment to equal human dignity, regardless of ability, productivity, or dependence on others. I want you to think about something as we close. The doctors convicted at Nuremberg weren't monsters. They were ordinary men, university educated, many with families. They didn't wake up deciding to become mass murderers. They took incremental steps. They accepted small compromises. They rationalized each decision. First, they agreed that resources were limited, that wartime required difficult choices. Then they accepted that not all lives had equal value. Then they believed the state had authority to make life and death decisions for the collective good. And eventually, they stood in gas chamber facilities, timing how long patients took to die and recording data for their reports. The progression wasn't sudden, it was gradual. And that's what makes the T4 program so important to understand. It shows how ordinary people, even educated professionals with ethical training, can rationalize extraordinary evil when they accept foundational premises that devalue certain human lives. The Nuremberg judges recognize this. Their judgment identifies the ideological starting point, the moment doctors accepted that medical decisions could be based on social utility rather than patient welfare, and says that premise itself is criminal. The 70,000 people killed in the T4 program died because German doctors convinced themselves that medical judgment could override patient autonomy, that professional authority justified ending lives without permission. The Nuremberg Tribunal said that logic was criminal, that medicine's power must always be constrained by the patient's will, that healing cannot become killing without destroying medicine itself. So the next time you sign an informed consent form before a medical procedure, understand what that document represents. It's not bureaucratic paperwork. It's a protection bought with 70,000 lives. It's a recognition that your body belongs to you, that no medical professional has authority to treat you without your permission. On June 2nd, 1948, 7 doctors hanged at Landsberg prison. Their medical degrees didn't save them. Their scientific credentials didn't excuse them. Their claims of good intentions didn't redeem them. They died because they used medical licenses to kill, because they transformed hospitals into execution centers. And the world, watching those executions, drew a line that says, never again will medical authority justify killing without consent. Never again will state policy override medical ethics. Never again will we accept that some lives are worth less than others. That line, established in courtroom 600 at Nuremberg, protects you every time you walk into a hospital. Now I want to hear from you. When you hear about healthcare rationing or end-of-life policy debates, does knowing about the T4 program change how you evaluate those discussions? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you found this deep dive valuable, please hit that like button and share this video. History like this needs to be remembered, especially the parts that make us uncomfortable. Subscribe if you want more detailed historical analysis using primary sources and trial records. Thanks for watching. And remember, every protection you have as a patient exists because someone, somewhere, once abused medicine so thoroughly that the world said enough. I'll see you in the next one.